Hey friends, this is episode 4 of the Spookcast. I decided today that it's time that we clear up some misunderstandings. I feel like there's some major issues that a lot of people have when it comes to Stirner, and I think one of the biggest reasons for this is that he was so radical in his approach. Especially if we're talking about mentality, that when you're spooked in any way, it's almost impossible to grasp his concepts. And yes, this sounds like a shit defense of some edgy philosopher, but that doesn't make it any less valid. Cognitive dissonance is a thing, and it's very popular among scared conformists. The truth is, we have various defense mechanisms within our psyche, and these are going to be hurled at any argument that upsets us, that makes us afraid. So unless you're willing to become deeply unspooked, or you're willing to admit that you don't believe in freedom, then you're not going to be able to engage with Stirner's thought. One of the main questions I get when trying to engage in Stirnerian thought is, if everyone is self-interested, then how would you prevent chaos? And how would any social cohesion be possible? And to that I say, why do you need to prevent chaos, and why do you need social cohesion? And that's exactly where the misunderstandings begin. People assume that without some higher ideal, be it morality or duty or some kind of collective struggle, everything would spiral into disorder. And they don't sit down to ask themselves what that assumption actually means, because it does mean something. It means that you feel threatened, and it means that you would choose to give away a piece of your and everyone else's autonomy to eliminate that threat, the threat that concerns you. So using that same logic, it also means that you see order as something imposed, something that has to be enforced from above, rather than something that emerges naturally from individuals pursuing their own interests. And if that's the case, then yes, you are spooked, because you're treating order as a sacred necessity rather than just another arrangement that exists as long as people find it useful. And the reason for this is fear and entitlement. So that's what I want to talk about today. Let's push this all a little further. Let me dissect your fears a little, because all fear has a fundamental structure, which is essentially built on nothing. So let me ask you, why do you assume that self-interest leads to chaos? Isn't it just as likely that people, when freed from imposed moralities, might form associations based on what actually benefits them? What is the structure of this massive, worldwide, Stockholm Syndrome-inducing fear that makes people believe they need to be protected? Let's get into it. This is something that Freud, for example, explains really well. In his text, Civilization and Its Discontents, he argues that civilization itself is built on a fundamental tension between individual desires and the need for social cohesion. So at its core, the formation of society is an attempt to mitigate the chaos of raw human instinct and to make the sort of wild and anarchic individual into something that's manageable, a manageable entity that fits within the rules of collective life. But here's the problem. This attempt doesn't actually eliminate chaos. It actually only represses it. The fear of chaos that the people who have a problem with Stirner usually talk about, the fear that people have of total disorder when they're freed from imposed morality, is actually rooted in the repression of this very chaos. So for Freud, the ego is built on a balancing act between the individual's desires and the demands of the superego, which is like the internalized authority that enforces societal rules. And the superego, as the psychological embodiment of authority and social expectations, makes people afraid to step outside the lines of accepted conduct because it activates feelings of guilt, shame, and anxiety. But if we take Stirner's view seriously, which I think we should, then that guilt and shame are actually the result of internalized social constructs. And then the whole structure of fear starts to look like bullshit. It starts to look like a house of cards. Lacan also talks about this, so let me tell you about that for a minute. So Lacan, who's kind of building on Freud, gives us like another perspective. He's concerned with the formation of what he calls the subject, so the individual who comes into being only in relation to the other. According to Lacan, we're always defined by the symbolic orders around us, meaning stuff like language, culture, laws, ideologies, and so forth. But these structures of meaning are never fully coherent, and the subject is always caught in the tension between the desire for autonomy and the need for recognition from the other. So this is what Lacan calls the mirror stage, where the individual first becomes aware of themselves as a separate being and yet is also bound by societal recognition to define themselves in relation to others. So when people fear chaos, what they're actually fearing is the dissolution of the symbolic order, which is like a loss of the very framework that defines them as individuals. So this fear is a reflection of Lacan's concept of the real, which is what he defines as that which lies beyond language and beyond symbolization. So it can never be fully integrated into our sense of self. And this fear of chaos is the fear of being thrown into the real, into a world without the structured meanings that we cling to and that are being fed to us for identity and ultimately security. So Stirner, by rejecting the imposition of external ideals and calling for self-assertion, is really challenging this entire structure. So he's saying that this fear of chaos, this like need for an external authority to prevent it, is rooted in bullshit. It's an illusion. It's a defense mechanism that keeps people in line with social expectations. And Stirner's egoism isn't just a rejection of societal norms. It's a call for like a deeper confrontation with the anxiety that underlies those norms. So it's more like an invitation to break free from the symbolic chains that bind us. So to circle back, this fear of chaos and maybe even, death, like the worst thing that could possibly happen because of the chaos, is actually the fear of self-determination. It's the fear of standing in our own autonomy and a fear of being free. It's a fear of being free from the need to justify your existence through some higher ideal. And that fear, which is rooted in nothing more than the social structures that have been ingrained in you, keeps you chained to the very system that limits your freedom. So Stirner's challenge is to break free from that exact fear and to embrace chaos as a space for creation rather than destruction, and to step into a world where, social cohesion isn't something imposed, but actually something that comes from individuals pursuing their own free interests. So knowing all of this, let's discuss society's awesome method to fixing the problem of chaos and the fear of self-determination, the concept of natural or human rights. So let's figure out what that means. The key features of natural rights are, number one, innateness. So natural rights aren't granted by governments, but are kind of inherent to human beings by virtue of their existence. That's the idea behind it. The second feature is universality. So the idea is that they apply to all individuals regardless of culture, time period, or legal system. Then the third would be moral objectivity, right? So they're based on some higher moral order, whether derived from reason or, God or nature or whatever. And then the fourth one is precedence over positive law, meaning they are considered superior to legal rights, right? Like laws enacted by governments, which means that unjust laws that violate natural rights are illegitimate, like fundamentally. Now, what are the philosophical origins? So the concept has some classical roots. So the idea of natural rights can be traced back to ancient Greece and Rome, particularly in Stoic philosophy, which kind of emphasized rational, universal, moral order. Aristotle, for example, spoke about a natural justice that exists beyond human conventions, and Cicero argued that true law is right reason in accordance with nature. Then we got some further roots in Christian and medieval thought. So Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century kind of built on Aristotle's ideas and tried to integrate them with Christian theology. So he argued that natural law, which derives from divine reason, I guess, grants individuals, certain kinds of moral entitlement. Then there's also some connection to early modern thinkers, like social contract theories. So the concept of natural rights became more politically significant in the early modern period, particularly with social contract theorists like Hugo Grotius. So this is a philosopher from the 17th century who argued that natural rights exist even if there were no divine authority. And, this is kind of an attempt to kind of step away from divine reason and to kind of ground it in human reason. Then we got Thomas Hobbes, 1650-something, I think, who viewed natural rights as the unrestricted freedom of individuals in the state of nature. So this includes the right to self-preservation. Although, it should be said that he believed that they had to be surrendered to the sovereign for societal order. Then we have John Locke, also 16-something, who famously formulated the theory that humans possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property, which governments have to protect. That's the idea. So if a government violates these rights, people have the right to overthrow it. And this idea really heavily influenced liberal democracy and the American and French revolutions. Then we have a connection to Enlightenment and revolutionary thought. So we got Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in, I don't know the exact dates, like 1700s, saw natural rights as kind of linked to human freedom and equality. I actually made a video about this. You should check it out. It's called Social Contract Theory. He saw natural rights as linked to human freedom and equality, and he argued that societies should be organized to reflect what he called the general will. Then Thomas Jefferson, of course, in 1776, invoked natural rights in the Declaration of Independence. There's a quote there that goes, hang on, let me see. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So, yeah. There you have it in black and white. Then there's the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This is from 1789 in revolutionary France, which kind of enshrined natural rights in a similar way as the foundation of government. Then we have a connection to Mr. Immanuel Kant, who talked about human dignity. So this is especially significant for Germany. It still is to this day part of the Constitution that your dignity is untouchable, supposedly. Immanuel Kant in 90 something, I think, argued that individuals have to be treated as ends in themselves, not merely as means. So what is called the categorical imperative provides a rational justification for universal human rights, which emphasizes autonomy and moral dignity. Then we have some critiques of natural rights, and this is definitely where Stirner also comes into the mix. But a famous one is Jeremy Bentham, who dismissed natural rights as complete nonsense and argued that rights must be grounded in practical, legal, and social benefits and can't be abstract or moral claims. Then we have Edmund Burke, who rejected the French Revolution's natural rights claims and argued that rights emerge from tradition and social order rather than universal reason. But another thing that I think is important to understand is how Stirner's critique actually differs from the common leftist, Marxist, socialist, and even in some cases anarchist critiques of natural rights. So I'm going to start with a claim. So my claim is that liberals, socialists, and even anarchists, to different degrees of course, still, even though they claim that they oppose the concept of natural rights, still cling to the idea that rights are something innate or something given, right? Because they assume that social cohesion needs a foundation, and that without some external guarantee, like, reason or human nature or whatever, everything falls apart. And this relates back to what I said in the beginning. This is where the fundamental divide between Stirner and most political thinkers becomes really clear, because those traditions operate on some version of natural rights or collective interests. Like, for example, liberals say we have to respect individual rights because they're inherent to human beings. And Marxists say that we have to work for the collective good because history necessitates it. But to Stirner, that's essentially the same thing. So, Stirner would say, what rights? What history? There's no natural law. There's no social contract. There's no quote-unquote species being that dictates how people should behave. So there's only the reality that you and I act according to our own desires, and sometimes those desires align, and that's beneficial. And this kind of brings us to the core of the natural rights debate, because liberals and Marxists both assume that there's some fundamental basis for human cooperation, whether it's reason or justice or class solidarity. Something bigger, right? Something bigger than the individual that makes society possible. But Stirner takes this and he flips this completely. He says that society isn't some higher entity that demands loyalty. It's literally just a network of individual interests. So rights aren't sacred principles, right? They're just privileges that exist as long as people have the power to enforce them. So the common good isn't some moral imperative. It's just what happens when people see mutual benefit. But I imagine some people are still asking, what about order? What about morality? What about fairness? And honestly, I have to ask you, whose order? Whose morality? Whose fairness? What are we talking about here? Because if you dig deep enough, you'll see that every single argument for higher principle is just someone else's ego trying to make their will universal, because they're fucking scared and feel entitled to that, having that fear alleviated. And this occurs at the expense of literally anyone who would choose autonomy over safety. I mean, how fucked is that? And that's where natural rights believers get it wrong. They act like rights are self-evident, as if like the universe itself guarantees them. But no right has ever existed unless people enforce it. So rights are only real when you have the strength to take them and the power to keep them. So, this kind of raises the actual question here, which is, do you want to keep believing in rights because it makes you feel secure, or do you actually want to live your own life on your own terms? Because I'm pretty sure most people would choose to keep believing in rights. So natural rights, also, referred to as, like inalienable, fundamental human rights, whatever, are rights that are believed to exist independently of human laws, customs, and institutions, and they're often thought to be intrinsic to human nature and universally applicable to all individuals, regardless of societal or governmental recognition. But that is fucking bullshit, isn't it? Because if rights were truly natural and we all had them by nature, then you wouldn't have to be so fucking scared to lose them, and this discussion would have never happened. Period. So to finish this, let's just kind of dissect this entire idea of natural rights. So first we have the right to live, right? And I would say, unless you're inconvenient, is the rule there. So they say that like everyone has the right to live, right? But it's funny how that right disappears the moment that you become an inconvenience. So if you're, unhoused, like I'm a social worker and I see this every single fucking day. If you're unhoused, well, I guess the right to live doesn't really matter anymore. Or if you're a civilian in a fucking war zone, have you ever heard of collateral damage? Or like, prisoners on death row. Justice, right? That's justice. Like, oh, but a billionaire with 24/7 security, yeah, that is protected. That's fucking protected, isn't it? So if the right to live were a real right, a real natural right, then we wouldn't have GoFundMe campaigns for fucking insulin. So the only real right to live is not pissing off people with power. What's the next one? The next one is the right to liberty. Okay, the right to liberty, but not too much liberty, right? So liberty sounds nice, doesn't it? Sounds almost like freedom. But what it actually is freedom on a leash. Because if you want to walk around naked, indecent exposure. If you want to live without paying rent, trespassing. If you want to disappear off the grid, suspicious activity. And what do we have? Do we have fucking human rights councils that are walking around and throwing the state in prison for doing this to people? No, they're not doing that. So the state's definition of liberty is like an all-you-can-eat buffet, except they decide what's on the menu, how much you can take, and if you can afford the entry fee. Do you know what I mean? So another fucking right that's bullshit. Then we have the right to property, right? Okay, well, whose property? What are you talking about? They tell you that you have the right to own things, but have you tried not paying property tax? Or let's say you're in a country sitting on some oil, right? Congratulations, you have a limited time offer on sovereignty before larger government liberates, quote unquote, your resources. So real property rights exist for number 1, corporations, number 2, landlords, and number 3, the people who wrote the fucking laws, not you. You just rent your entire existence. Then we have the right to happiness. Okay, well, isn't that a fucking joke? Because they say you have the right to pursue happiness, and by happiness, what they mean is, number 1, buying things you don't need, 2, working a job you hate, and 3, watching fucking Marvel movies until you die so that you can escape the reality that you're in. So if happiness were a right, then antidepressants wouldn't cost $200 a bottle, and we would get happiness as a product delivered in dopamine drip notifications and seasonal discounts. You know what I mean? So it's bullshit. Then we have the right to equality, but just some are more equal than others. So all humans are born equal is the idea behind it, right? That's the famous quote. Well, I don't know about you, but have you heard of nepotism? Have you met a billionaire's child? The rule is some people are born with generational wealth and connections, and others are born into a systemic disadvantage, and the rest is kind of like the audience in the Hunger Games. So yeah, equality exists in the same way that fucking unlimited breadsticks at Olive Garden exists. All right, then we have the right to self-defense, right? Okay, well, the right to self-defense, that sounds kind of reasonable, but it's not quite true, is it? Because if you're rich, it's called standing your ground. If you're a nation with a big military, it's called national security. If you're a protester defending against cops, it's called rioting. So, funny how self-defense is only legal when it benefits those that are in power. If you're poor, marginalized, or just exist in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time, self-defense becomes a crime. So yeah, fuck you. And last but not least, we got the right to work. Okay, the right to work, sure. But the truth is you're disposable, You have the right to work, meaning you have the right to be exploited for wages that keep you alive, barely. So, billion-dollar companies pays workers starvation wages. If you're an employee asking for a raise, fuck you, there's the door. You know what I mean? So, and what happens if you don't want to work? You're suddenly a lazy, entitled parasite. Never mind that most rich people are living off passive income, which is just welfare for people with good lawyers, So the right to work is really the right to be someone else's profit margin. This is the reality that we're in. So anyone telling you that you have natural rights is fucking lying to you. And it's working because you're scared. So, hey, I think that's a pretty good ending to my little rant about natural rights. Let's head over to the next segment where we're going to discuss the concept of ownness and selfhood. So I asked some people on YouTube to tell me which spooks are haunting them, and there were some differing but somewhat connected responses, and in an attempt to please everyone, I decided to do something more broad today and talk about what Jenna even means by ownness, self-ownership, and kind of how he defines selfhood. And I wanna, because it kind of includes like everything mentioned, like identity, personality, and all the spooks that are related to that. So let's start with something someone once told me. Selfhood is what you're told to find, shape, and protect. Ownness is what you take. Selfhood demands coherence. Ownness demands nothing. I know that was so fucking deep, wasn't it? Anyways, so let's start at the beginning. What is selfhood? Selfhood is the idea that there's a you inside of there somewhere, right? Something stable, identifiable, and most importantly, comprehensible. So this is why selfhood is tied to identity, because to have a self is to be something that can be understood by others, whether through actions, beliefs, or personal ideas or narratives. So we see this everywhere. Like, think about therapy culture, self-improvement books, personality tests, and, politics, all that. The goal is often to like uncover or refine the self and to treat it as a kind of core essence that just needs the right conditions to fully emerge. And in this framework, the self is something that has to be nurtured and discovered and optimized and improved upon and all that shit. But then we have psychology, and psychology takes a slightly different approach because psychologists define selfhood through things like personality traits and values, behavior, or some kind of sense of continuity. So the idea that you are the same person over time, right? That is what personality is. And this is a totally different angle. So here, selfhood isn't necessarily about discovery, but about stability. So the self here is something measurable, something that's categorized by traits, or what else do psychologists use to define people? Like attachment styles, or, cognitive patterns, or social behaviors. So it's not about searching for some true you, it's about tracking patterns and how you already behave. But let's move a little bit closer to a Stirnerian model. If identity tries to make you legible and personality tries to make you consistent, then existentialism tries to make you free. Okay? So existentialists like Sartre tell us that we are something like radically free, right? Selfhood isn't about uncovering a core essence, but about creating one, right? So you are what you do. You are your choices, and there's no essential you beyond that. And this is actually a commonly held perspective, even nowadays. This is a break from the idea that selfhood is something given to you. Instead, existentialism presents it as a project, right? One you are constantly constructing through your choices. So the burden shifts from discovery to responsibility. So in this framework, you have to define yourself, and no external force can do it for you. But even here, there is a paradox, and Stirner calls that shit out. Because in order to define yourself, you still need a self to define in the first place. So the existentialist self is still a project because it's tied to the assumption that there's something to construct, right? So the existentialist self is a project, yes, but it remains tied to the assumption that there is something to construct. So the idea of selfhood still remains intact in this scenario. It's just been shifted from something static to something dynamic. So you're still a self, you're just a self that is consistently kind of becoming, right? And I think this is where Stirner comes in, because Stirner exposes a fundamental issue with selfhood, even in its most existentially open form. Because the issue isn't whether selfhood is something given or discovered or constructed. The issue is that it isn't actually yours. So selfhood as a concept is a spook. It's an abstraction, right? So whether it's identity or personality or the existentialist constructed self thing, the problem remains the same. Selfhood makes you bound to an idea of yourself, even when it stops serving you. And that is not self-ownership. It turns you into something that has to be maintained and justified and made coherent. It makes you intelligible, not just to others, but also to yourself. Even in its most radical freeform version, the idea of selfhood as it stands still demands some kind of allegiance to an identity or personality type or a set of values, a sense of continuity. And that is the real trap. So let's break it down step by step. Because what I want to do is I want to kind of propose a new way of looking at ownness, which might help in avoiding a lot of the definition problems. So the way that I tend to look at ownness is that self-ownership is possible through radical self-rejection, right? But let me explain, because that sounds a little bit ridiculous. So if existentialists want to liberate the self by making it a project, Stirner actually goes a little bit further than that, because he asks, why do I need to have a project at all, right? He basically says your project is a spook, right? So this is where Stirner's egoism is widely misunderstood, in my opinion, because many people assume that it's just like another form of self-assertion, or like an elevation of the individual over all external impositions. But this reading kind of misses the point, because Stirner's egoism isn't about replacing imposed identities with a truer or stronger self at all. It's about rejecting selfhood altogether. So unlike existentialists who still see the self as something that has to be constructed, Stirner refuses to turn selfhood into another burden. So this means that the egoist doesn't need to discover or define or build a self, because all of these actions presume that the self is something separate from immediate experience, or something that has to be justified or, made coherent. Instead of doing this, Stirner treats selfhood as a disposable tool, or something to be used when convenient, or, discarded when it ceases to serve us. So the egoist doesn't identify with any fixed notion of selfhood, because identification itself is a form of enslavement. So to define oneself is to become bound by that definition, just as surely as if it were imposed by any external force. And this is why Stirner does not offer a path forward, which is a critique that I hear often of Stirner, is that there's no constructive kind of, there's no suggestions, like there's no practical advice. But the reason why he does that is because to do so would be to reintroduce a new spook, which, would kind of defeat the purpose. By refusing to give a methodology, Stirner actually ensures that egoism remains truly individual, and he safeguards his own authenticity, right? So therefore, it's incapable of becoming an ideology or a movement or a dogma. His silence isn't an oversight, in my opinion, it's a tactic. It prevents his ideas from being institutionalized and standardized and turned into another imposed identity. So this means that Stirner's egoism isn't an assertion of self, but a radical self-rejection. Okay, it's a rejection of any imposed, fixed, and expected notion of what self is supposed to be. So there are many philosophies of selfhood, and most of those philosophies, even those that claim to be liberatory, still function through self-assertion, right? So even when framed as individualistic or self-determined, these models still demand some kind of ongoing commitment to selfhood. And they tell you that you have to maintain an identity or a narrative or some kind of core being that makes you intelligible, even if that core being is like nothingness out of which being kind of, flows through choices. So Stirner's egoism, by contrast, kind of functions through self-rejection. And this is what makes it so complicated, in my opinion. So the egoist doesn't need an identity because identity is a trap. And the egoist doesn't need a coherent self because coherence is a spook. And the egoist doesn't need a method because methods create new authorities. So the true egoist, as stupid as that sounds, is not someone who has quote-unquote found themselves or built their ideal self. The egoist is someone who has abandoned selfhood as a requirement altogether. So if Stirnerian egoism is a radical self-rejection, then what's left, right? If there's no stable self to nurture or optimize, then what does the egoist do, right? Do you just sit there and do nothing? Well, the answer is simple. It's whatever you want. Egoism doesn't provide some kind of vision of how to live because a grand vision would simply replace a spook with another. So instead, it offers something far more immediate, which is the ability to act without justification, right? No justification needed. So to reject selfhood is to reject the need for consistency, coherence, and explanation. Okay? You don't owe anybody any explanations, and nobody owes explanations to you. So the egoist doesn't need to be true to themselves because there's no fixed self to be true to. Okay? They can take up identities when useful and discard them when they cease to serve them. They can contradict themselves without guilt. I love contradicting. Contradicting yourself is the greatest thing ever. You confuse the fuck out of people. You can change without needing permission, and you can exist without being legible to society or ideology or even to your past self. So Stirner doesn't tell us what to do because that too would be a spook. So instead, what he does is he presents the possibility of a life without obligation to selfhood at all. Okay? Stirner lives in constant indifference to anything that could possibly define him. So I think that radical self-rejection as a form of self-ownership is a weapon against spooks. Okay? So every spook that the people that commented on my question about spooks on YouTube, every spook these people struggle with shares the same fatal weakness because it requires belief and it relies on obligation. So the moment you stop believing in it, it crumbles. That's how you know it's a fucking spook, you know? Radical self-rejection is not, it's not what it sounds like. It's not passive nihilism. It's an active, tactical refusal to be bound by ideas that don't belong to you. And the reason why self-rejection is so important is because you're rejecting the almost essential element that every single spook is related to and tied to. Okay, so ownness is not just rejecting spooks, it's taking possession of yourself. The world will try to make you feel like you owe it something, you know, to, I don't know, morality or expectations or competence or an imaginary better you. Okay, but you own nothing to anyone. Radical self-rejection means you don't need to become, justify, or conform. You only need to act from your own power, moment to moment, and free from obligation. And when you stop serving your spooks, they actually vanish because they were never real to begin with. So let's talk about the spooks that my audience brought up, or that the audience brought up. We got competence, societal and interpersonal expectations, and morality. And these all seem distinct, but they share the same root, which is selfhood. So this is kind of how I brought it together. So each of them holds power over you because they demand that you conform to a particular self. So like one that's capable, acceptable, and righteous. But, you know, let's just break it down in terms of selfhood. So let's look at competence. The demand to be competent is the demand to prove yourself, right? It's not just proving yourself to others, but also to yourself. So it requires you to see yourself as a stable and like measurable entity that can succeed or fail according to some kind of external standard. But competence is a spook because it assumes that you are something that has to be validated, right? That has to be legitimate. So the egoist doesn't need to prove anything though. You can gain skills, you can use knowledge, and you can engage in activities without binding yourself to an idea of being competent or incompetent. So ownness in this sense means engaging with the world on your own terms, not because you meet some imposed metric. Then we have societal and interpersonal expectations. So expectations are like a direct demand for selfhood, right? So the idea is to meet expectations. Like you have to maintain a consistent, recognizable self that aligns with what others want from you. Whether that's, you know, being a good friend or, I don't know, like a reliable employee or a fucking upstanding citizen. But this demand isn't external alone because you internalize it and you turn it into an obligation to be yourself in a way that's legible to society. So ownness as a concept would reject this, right? Ownness means taking up roles when they serve you and dropping them when they do not serve you. Okay, so it means refusing to be defined by the gaze of others or by the internalized demand to be coherent and predictable. It's similar with morality. So morality is the most insidious spook, right? Because it disguises itself as something higher than you, right? An objective or a high standard to which you have to conform. But morality is nothing more than than an abstraction that claims authority over your actions, which makes you justify yourself in its name. Okay, so you subordinate yourself to it. So the egoist, in the sense of ownness, doesn't reject morality in favor of immorality, like that would be, playing by its rules. Instead, the egoist sees morality as just another tool, right? Useful when it serves and irrelevant when it doesn't. So there's no value judgment here. Like, radical self-rejection means refusing to let any kind of framework dictate your ownness, because it just doesn't matter. It's not real. It's not necessary. So in that sense, ownness isn't just about rejecting spooks. It's taking possession of yourself. The world will try to make you feel like you owe it something, to morality or to expectations, to competence, to be a better you somehow, but you don't owe anything. So something that I want to say to end this segment is to talk a little bit about Stirner's idea of creative potential. Okay, so Stirner's egoism, in my opinion, isn't about discovering any kind of true self or building an identity or something like that. It's about realizing that the self is nothing more than a construct of external forces, and these constructs are often perceived as truths about us, but Stirner, teaches that we have to look forward and not to uncover something essential, but to see that we are creative potential, right? And this is not creative potential in the same way that Stirner or the existentialists portray it, right? Because when we embrace this kind of creative potential, we stop perceiving ourselves as a fixed point altogether. Like, we're not a self that has to be maintained or optimized or justified. We kind of become a process of continuous movement, which is constantly transforming and interacting and reshaping ourselves in relation to the world around us. So this shift is key here. It's the key difference. We don't need to be a stable identity to act in the world. Our true agency emerges, not from like a static self, but from an openness to possibility and a refusal to be trapped in the definitions of who we should be. So in this way, we aren't just reacting to external forces, but we're trying to conform to expectations or gain approval. So in this way, we aren't just reacting to external forces and trying to conform to expectations or gain approval. We actually start to engage with the world as creators rather than subjects. And selfhood isn't something that we discover, So I'll just give some little shitty advice here. When it comes to competence, I would say, instead of trying to prove your competence, just engage with others as collaborators. Like, see it more like a creative, free from pressure kind of, thing, right? Because you're kind of able to then shift things from a performance to something that is about experiencing something in the moment. So skills are not personal attributes. You have to optimize, but resources you can take and use creatively in response to the needs of the moment. So if you drop the idea that your competence is a fixed thing, then you'll probably find yourself much freer to act and experiment, which is probably actually going to make you more skilled and more competent ultimately. And in terms of societal and interpersonal expectation, instead of resisting or striving to meet expectation, just kind of step back and ask, why are these expectations being placed on me? Notice how they function and create your role within the structure. Because when you realize that these expectations are not about the true self or whatever other bullshit, but that they are actually about a social game, then you kind of gain the freedom to move through them and to subvert them and, even ignore them entirely. So this is about owning your agency. Own your agency by rejecting the role that they want you to play. And in terms of morality, instead of building your actions around moral principles, observe them in real time. Morality becomes a tool when you refuse to tie it to your identity. So you can act with empathy and compassion or even defiance without needing to justify it according to moral standards. So the more you use morality rather than becoming bound by it, the more you actually align with your potential as a creative, agent. So radical self-rejection is like the fundament here, right? It's like the foundation of this idea. You have to kind of give away any notions of what you're supposed to be able to engage with the world as an agent person. So the more you practice this kind of radical self-rejection, the more you'll realize that the self isn't a thing that you need to protect or prove at all. It's actually something that only exists when you're free from the spooks that try to define it. So you become a force, right? You become an agent. You're constantly creating and recreating your relationships to the world. And this is how we own ourselves ultimately, not by defining or refining a fixed identity, but by constantly refusing to be bound by identities that others want us to have, that others want us to adopt. So in that freedom, your creative potential can flow. All right, I hope that helped a little bit. Let's move on to the spotlight segment. So I did something kind of lame here, which is actually kind of funny if you think about it. But I guess it is a bit lame, but I felt like I wanted to explain something since I've been trying to write applications for grants and shit. Shout out to Ownness, by the way, who got that whole thing started from the project Patreon. Basically, I'm going to be analyzing my own essay, okay? Because I want to talk about why I think Stirner is relevant. And to me, I don't know, this just feels like the right time because I've been thinking about it a lot, writing these applications for grants and stuff. So to me, Stirner represents a kind of safeguard to authenticity within resistance movements. And I wanted to kind of explain my thoughts there by analyzing and kind of summarizing my essay, right? The essay is called Why the World Needs a Stirner Comeback. All right, let's just do it the way that I would do any other essay. Let's just go through it, look at structure, and look at key arguments. In this essay, I present 3 main arguments for why I think Stirner is so relevant to contemporary culture, society, and so forth. So this essay is a critical analysis of Max Stirner's philosophy, and it argues for its radical liberatory potential in the face of modern societal structures. So what we have here is an analysis of Max Stirner's philosophy, which argues for its radical and liberatory potential in the face of modern societal structures, particularly the limitations posed by Marxist materialism and Hegelian idealism, which still run wild. And I tend to see them and the way that they have shaped the ways people think, process, and navigate information, and kind of the whole production of capitalism as, very problematic. So here's a breakdown of the key arguments, and I'm gonna just throw in some quotes. So this essay begins with a personal reflection on fleeting moments of insight, right? So I'm just gonna read it to you. We've all had those moments, the drunken nights, the acid trips, the fleeting epiphanies, where the fabric of reality begins to unravel. In these moments, we glimpse something deeper, something that seems profoundly important. But then the sun rises, we clock into work, and the insight dissolves, leaving behind the monotony of the world that feels unchangeable. The cycle of realization and repression is no coincidence. It reflects a fundamental tension between individual agency and the external structures that shape and constrain it. While thinkers like Marx and Hegel have presented sophisticated frameworks for understanding this tension, both dialectical materialism and idealism often leave us trapped in their oppositional logic, viewing reality through the lens of predetermined contradictions. Enter Max Stirner, a thinker who negates both frameworks by recentering the individual as the foundation of reality itself. In a world where identity politics, neoliberalism, and morality reign supreme, Stirner's philosophy offers a radical liberatory perspective that remains strikingly relevant today. In the next part, I move on to critique Marx and Hegel by arguing that both offer incomplete visions of reality, which I see as the fundament of all things problematic, and how, collectivism has structured the shit space in which we have to exist now. So Marxist materialism posits that material conditions shape thought and society. And Hegel's idealism suggests that ideas and consciousness shape the material world. But Stirner kind of, interestingly enough, rejects and also kind of connects both of those frameworks. So in the text, I say the following. For Stirner, reality is neither solely material nor purely ideological. It's a playground where the self interacts with both in ways that are inconsequential unless the individual asserts ownership over their experience. So what I'm trying to say here is that Stirner locates change in the individual's ability to claim agency over their own experience. So self-ownership, right? Ownness. So this is the key to personal transformation. And this is at the foundation of societal patterns, societal movement. And the reason why I believe this perspective is so important is because it offers a counterbalance to these dominant structures, this dominant dichotomy between materialism and idealism that has shaped our understanding. And this is vital because it liberates us from the passive role that we're often taught to occupy. So both Marx and Hegel frame individuals as products of larger predetermined systems, whether economic or ideological, whatever, which means that we can become stuck thinking that our actions and thoughts are just reflections of those structures. But Stirner's philosophy disrupts this narrative and kind of posits that we can break free from these external spooks and assert our own power, not as like isolated beings, but as active creators of our own experiences. And to me, this is where Stirner becomes so incredibly relevant today, because we live in a world that is dominated by systems that encourage us to see ourselves as either victims of capitalism or proponents of some idealized vision of progress. So whether it's like identity politics or neoliberalism or morality of social movements or whatever, these forces, they demand that we conform to predefined roles and ideologies, which strips us of the autonomy Stirner emphasizes. So Stirner's focus on ownness is a radical antidote to this pressure. It's like an insistence that real liberation doesn't come from conforming to some external model, but from reclaiming our individuality. Then in the next part, I address common misconceptions about Stirner's radical individualism, and I try to explain how egoism is not the same as Ayn Rand's objectivism or any kind of, resulting neoliberal self-interest definition. So Stirner's vision rejects objectifying reality, or morality, or even the self. Instead, Stirner promotes a more dynamic relationship between self and other. So in this relationship, power arises not from dominating others, but from rejecting external constructs. So in this text, I say, for Stirner, power stems not from control over others, but from the individual's refusal to be controlled by external constructs. And this is further contrasted in my essay with Simone de Beauvoir's concepts outlined in The Ethics of Ambiguity, which honestly you need to read. That book is so fucking good. So in this book, she explains that freedom is rooted in an ethical system that acknowledges the limitations of radical self-concern. So Stirner's thought actually shares this understanding. This is actually very interesting, but it shares this understanding because it emphasizes the importance of rejecting external authority rather than asserting dominance. So here I'm explaining how the misunderstanding and undermining of Stirner is possibly the result of this need to have a collective, cohesive identity and image of what it is to be human and how reality should be constructed. So this relates back to what I was talking about in the first segment. So my claim is basically that this reductionist perspective of Stirner was essentially driven by Marxist and Hegelian ideological forces which shaped society and essentially our social reality into what it is now. And Ayn Rand and the neoliberal understanding of self-interest that followed, in capitalism was actually a direct result of this very repression of the individual, which Stirner warned us about, and which, to tie it back to the second segment, is essentially the result of the fear of self-determination. And then in the next part, I discuss how Stirner's ideas are also connected to contemporary critiques of capitalism and subjectivity, particularly the work of Deleuze and Guattari. So what I'm trying to say here is that capitalism produces subjectivities through repression and sublimation, which mirrors Stirner's claim that subjectivity is a product of external forces. So in the text I say, Stirner's concept of the spook parallels Deleuze and Guattari's body without organs, a conceptualization of the self as pure potential, unregulated by external constraints. So the spook distorts the individual's agency by creating false dichotomies, such as the distinction between the spiritual and sensual, if we're going to use Stirner's example with Feuerbach. By rejecting these spooks, Stirner kind of paves the way for reclaiming the body as a site of power and autonomy. So what I'm saying here is that both Stirner and Deleuze and Guattari are concerned with the ways in which external forces shape and constrain individual agency to produce or further mobilize the machine of capitalism. And so what we're talking about here is a process of commodification, which is fueled by the individual's need to produce identities to fit into boxes, which can then lead to more consumption, right? To more production and more consumption. And this is the process by which the already suppressed and repressed individual becomes even more easily subjectivized. So it's the main problem that I have with capitalism. It's massive power to commodify identity, to produce copies of copies, which then ultimately become, something to consume, but also more copies until they're reshaped into whatever the newest awesome thing is, which can then be reshaped, commodified, consumed, copied, whatever the fuck. And this creates a reality in which individuals are nothing but subjects that consume and are consumed. So these three aspects of how Stirner and his thought have been suppressed is why he's so relevant today, in my opinion. And I just want to read the conclusion of the text to you today, and then I'm going to end the podcast. And we're going to call it a day, friends. So here's the end. Here's the conclusion, called The Liminal Path to Ownness. Stirner's philosophy is not a static doctrine, but a liminal process. He identifies stages of development through which individuals must pass to achieve ownness, rejecting fixed concepts like morality and embracing the irrelevance of external validation. This process, however, is not about self-help or psychological improvement, but about dismantling the structures that produce subjectivity in the first place. In this sense, Stirner anticipates many of the insights of postmodern and post-structuralist thought. By negating both materialism and idealism, he reveals the interconnectedness of thought and reality, while asserting the primacy of individual agency. His vision of ownness as a fluid, dynamic force offers a powerful alternative to the stifling binaries that continue to dominate philosophical and political discourse. Stirner's philosophy is not for the faint of heart. It demands a radical rethinking of the self and its relationship to the world, a willingness to confront the spooks that govern our lives, and the courage to reclaim our ownness in the face of external pressures. But in a time when identity, morality, and power are increasingly mediated by systems that seek to control and commodify us, Stirner's insights are more relevant than ever. The world does not need more hierarchies of virtue or systems of empowerment that rely on external validation. What it needs is a return to the individual, not as an isolated atom, but as a site of power, agency, and potential. Stirner understood this, and it is high time that we did too. Let us reclaim the epiphanies of those drunken nights and acid trips, and with Stirner as our guide, turn them into something enduring. Okay, thank you everyone for being here and listening. Please check out all the links for how you can support the project if you want to. You can check out the Patreon, you can check out the Substack, you can check out the, Spotify or YouTube or whatever. There's various ways that you can support. We also have a merch store where we sell some cool Stirner designs. You can also just, kind of hang around and, leave some comments, talk to people, stuff like that. And of course, like, share, and all that jazz. That's also very helpful. You can also add me on socials. You can support me personally if you want to, just, me as a writer and a YouTuber. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So I hope you have a wonderful week, and remember not to let the spooks get you.